So now let's talk about contrast. And as I had spoke to you guys earlier, when we were talking about contrast. Contrast really doesn't have anything to do with how dark the darks are or how light the lights are. It has to do with the relationship of the darkest dark and the lightest light. In other words, if I have something that is middle gray and it is positioned next to something that is black, and those are the only two values that I have in my photograph, then that would be considered a high contrast image. The reason is there's no space in between the gray and the black, right? The gray would be the bright and the black would be the dark. If we move it up the scale and we have just white and middle gray, we're still talking about high contrast if we have only white and gray in the image, because there's nothing in between. So when we're talking about quality of light, and when we're talking about the contrast of a scene as it has to do with photography, what we're really talking about is how many shades in between the brightest bright and the darkest dark do we have. And effectively, the more shades you have in between, the longer the contrast range is. In other words, the more values you have to transition from light to dark, the scene tends to look lower and lower in contrast. So therefore, how do we modify and how do we control the contrast of a scene, given what I was just describing, given that we're not talking about bright and dark, we're talking about creating a lot of value in between. Now, as always, we set up our set using a key light. We always set up a key light source and we determine where it's directed. Okay? Even if we intend to use 16 different lights in our scenario, we would always start with one light and we would position it according to what we're trying to achieve. So in this scenario, I'm asking you guys to position the light. If your camera's in the front here, then I would say it's 1, 2, 3, 4, position 4, or position 6. Okay, you could have it at position 7 or 3. That would be fine too, but we don't necessarily want the key light in front of the scene. We want to have the light sort of behind the scene, not directly behind, but at an angle behind. And then what we're going to do is to modify or to add more value into the darker areas here, instead of, as we did with the intensity, where we added another light source, a fill. Instead, what we're going to use is quite possibly the most simple yet useful tools in photography, and that is a reflecting card. And a reflecting card can be made out of something as simple as a piece of paper, really. But here we have some foam board. And the reason I have this hinge like this is so that it stands up. So I can just set it up here and I can position it so that it won't fall over and it can be hands-free. Effectively, what we're going to be doing with this is we're going to be bouncing the light that is coming from the key light back into the scene, and essentially it becomes a fill light. But it's not a fill light, it's a reflected light. And reflected light is always going to be much more soft than direct light. So if we have a direct light, i.e. a fill light, the result is going to be much more harsh. We're actually adding another light source to the scene. In this case, what we're doing is we are bouncing the same light source. We're not increasing the intensity of the scene. What we're doing is we are adjusting the contrast range by adding more values to the scene. And this can be done very subtly. This is one of those tools that we use all the time on location, because of course when we're outside, the sun is the key light source. And in order to be able to use that, what we would tend to do is we would find a way to catch the light with our white card, or it could be a silver card. But either way, we're catching the light and reflecting it back into the scene. If you were to pull back on a lot of shots that you see on location of models or some sort of picture story, you would be oftentimes seeing an assistant on the ground, you know, sort of underneath the model, and what they would be doing is they're going to be holding a reflecting card, trying to catch light and bounce it into the shadows to create this beautiful sort of look. So we're going to be modifying the contrast of our set by using the reflecting card. It's very simple instruction. Use the reflecting card in creative ways in order to bounce light and reflect it back into the scene. It's a very simple thing to do, but there are so many different ways in which we can modify the scene this way. It's much different doing this than it would be to add a fill light. And for that reason, we're separating the two. Adding a fill light would be adjusting intensity of the set. Here, what we're doing is we're adjusting the contrast of the set by using a card to fill in. And that is how we're going to be addressing the fourth quality of light, which is contrast.